guard. And with that said, I'd like to just go ahead and state our community action promise, which says community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves, and are very important. As I said, they ground our work. Those statements ground who we are, and certainly provide, I think, some wonderful foundation to the conversation that will be facilitated for us by our colleague Jim Masters on Stansbury on today. And so without further ado, I'm happy to just pass the baton on to Jim and to Alan. You all are ready. So Jim and Alan, you are on.
Hello? Alan?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Let me take the opportunity to introduce our session here, and then swing it to Jim. First and foremost, our topic is what your CAAs should do next. It's a summary of our white paper recommendations, our white paper that we made available at the National Conference in Austin last month. And so, Jim, do you want to take it away here?
Sure. So our next slide, the white paper was produced in draft form. It has not yet been thoroughly reviewed by the partnership staff or OCS, which funded this learning community. But the gist of our assignment was, Jim and Alan, tell us everything you know. That's why this thing was 100 pages long, because we know a lot. But the other dimension of this was we are generally in agreement with the new reality that the partnership is sponsoring, that in the long run we face serious resource depletion in the form of oil or water, and that we've got some long-term looming trends, whether these are happening now or 5 years from now or 20 years from now. We can debate that, but we're generally in agreement with the new reality that things are going to get very much worse for people with low income. So our challenge was to fill in the 5 to 10 year future between now and the 15 or 20 year future, when the new reality really kicks in and we run out of fracked oil, et cetera, and talk about what we can do to improve the lives of people with low incomes, particularly in terms of their ability to make a living. So we have put together in the white paper a series of chapters. Let's go on to, we see the link in the next slide. We see the hot link to the draft of the white paper in the next slide. Am I clicking this, or is somebody there clicking it? Oh, I'm clicking it. Look at that. All right. So if you click on this, you'll get the full white paper. There's also a 17-page summary. The topics in the white paper are proposals to change the rules under which the economy operates. There are about 40 million people who are not making it in America in the way we think of the American dream working. There's 5 million open jobs. So we've got to change the rules under which the economy operates in order to provide more jobs and to provide jobs that pay a decent wage. We also discuss issues in human development, the safety net, family formation issues, the reframing discussion about how we talk about poverty and economic security. We look at globalization, some international comparisons. America's #1 except in the many areas where we are either 17th or 31st or 22nd or whatever. We have a new section on affordable housing. Alan is quite an expert on this topic. And then in Chapter 8, the high probability of even more unhappy scenarios. This is where we go into climate change and the other things that the new reality talks about. And then a section on how we bring about change, which we're going to touch briefly on today. So we're going to start, the white paper pulled together from about 40 think tanks and researchers, all of their recommendations and suggestions for how we can improve the economy, make people's lives better. So we went through dozens of papers from these organizations and selected the ones that we think have the most relevance for community action, i.e. the community action agencies that actually help do something about. So the context within which we are presenting these recommendations is that there's just not enough opportunities for people to work. The primary reasons for this have to do with automation, globalization sending jobs overseas, corporate practices that systematically have flattened wages for most wage earners, and the failure of government policy. So as a result of these, economic mobility has declined. There are not enough opportunities to get higher education at a reasonable cost, and it's true that a higher education from about the late 1940s into the 1990s was almost a guarantee that you were going to get out of poverty. That strategy has pretty much reached the limits on a societal basis, in that you now have millions of people coming out saddled with a large amount of debt that they can't find a way to pay off. As a result of that, people are getting married later, they're buying houses later, and working at jobs trying to pay off this large amount of college debt. So as we continue with a few more examples, hang on. We see that the access to preventive health care and health insurance is very uneven among the states. You would think that America, like most other industrial societies, would have, I'm trying to turn my other phone off here, would have come up with some sort of form of national health insurance or national health care. America is the only one of the major industrial Western societies that has not yet done that. And we have about 17 states that have refused to participate in the Medicaid expansion. I remember when Clarence Carter was the director of OCS in the Bush administration, he put together a little task force, and they estimated that about 30% of poverty was caused by health-related issues, either health problems themselves or the necessity of a person to care for somebody in the family, and so they lost work and lost income. There are major infrastructure issues, and as a result of the general trends here, economic security has been reduced in the last 30 years. America's middle class has been shrinking. It used to be 61% of the population. Now it's about 50%. So our proposal is that while it's good to help people and give them cheese and point them to the job openings at the fast food restaurants and so forth, that we really need to restructure, major restructuring of the economy, both in the private sector and the public sector. In the public sector, for example, we believe in those think tank recommendations that talk about investing more public money, particularly in infrastructure. And we have a whole description of that issue in the white paper. We think that public service employment, particularly in jobs, in energy conservation, and in healthcare, merits additional investment. And we look at the sharing economy. This is Uber and Lyft and so forth. And while the disintermediation, if you will, jumping directly from provider to consumer without the intervening layers, on the one hand, makes things more efficient. On the other hand, it cuts out a whole middle layer of people running warehouses, taxi companies, et cetera, who formerly had jobs. The other thing about the sharing economy, as you've probably seen in one of our previous webinars, is that the average person working in the sharing economy, the gig economy, makes about $9,000 a year. So while this can be a supplement, it's not enough to provide a real family income. We're going to talk more about wage theft and job misclassifications later. Alan's got quite good information on this. And then, yes, as currently being discussed in the national election, we should expand work support programs, child care, family leave, paid sick leave, et cetera, require that work schedules be predictable. Here in California, there's a move that employers must tell employees 2 weeks in advance what their schedule is going to be, or have to pay them overtime if they call them in at the last minute. So those are worth doing, but those are the work support programs do not in and of themselves solve poverty problems, but they help it. So continuing this, and we look at changing the rules here, we think the whole concept of 2-year community college education for free makes a lot of sense, and this is something that CAAs can really get into. We think there will be universal preschool in America, like there are in some other countries, and it will be run by the states, and it will be done primarily through the school system, and we have to figure out how we're going to relate to that. And then access to affordable child care, which both candidates for president seem to be promoting. So when we look at some of the myths that exist, this idea that businesses and business owners and investors are the job creators is looking at what happens as a result of increase in demand, but that increase in demand happens primarily because the population expands and or people consume more. Income equality is a challenge and can be addressed through tax reforms, and we go into that in some detail in the white paper. And then expanding the earned income tax credits. To really make a dent, it should be about 4 times as big as it is. It should cover a lot more people, and there ought to be other ways that people can qualify for the earned income tax credit. So there's also been a persistent myth for the past 40 years that increasing wages, in particular the minimum wage, is a job killer. The research on this from study after study after study says that at most it reduces the number of people who are working by maybe 0.1%, but for the other people who are benefiting from it, it significantly raises their income. If the minimum wage had risen at the same rate productivity rose for the past 50 years, the minimum wage would be about $22 an hour now. When I first started work at the U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity in 1966, he's really old, a person who started a job at the minimum wage at the time, about $1.50 an hour, that family moved out of poverty. Not by much, but in fact a job at the minimum wage was enough to move a person over the federal poverty line. Now a job at the minimum wage pays about half of the federal poverty line. So it's just not a reasonable situation to leave the minimum wage stuck in the mud like it has been. There are issues with regard to gender pay gap. There's a Paycheck Fairness Act that's bubbling around in Congress, probably not much chance of passage in the near future, but it's the right idea and something that we can do. We talk about amending the tax code for multinational corporations that currently have huge amounts of cash in U.S. banks and overseas. People say, oh, we ought to give them a break so they can bring the money home. Well, we tried that in 1994 under George H.W. Bush, and they did bring the money home, and they did not use it to create new jobs or invest in new R&D. They brought the money home, and they turned it over to the investors and the stockholders and the hedge funds. Dodd-Frank is on the right pathway toward preventing bank and financial practices that caused the last recession. It baffles me that there are ongoing efforts by the banks and their hundreds of lobbyists and their friends in Congress to erode, undercut, chip away at the protections that Dodd-Frank tried to build into the system. But the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and Dodd-Frank merit our continued support. So we've got several things going on in terms of initiatives for increased housing areas and expensive areas, whether this is mortgage subsidies for teachers and cops and firemen, letting people build a granny unit in their backyard, et cetera. We're going to go into that a little more in a future slide here. So when we look at human development, those are rules to change the economy and how it operates and how profits are distributed between the workers and the managers and the hedge funds. We looked at some human development issues, and we think the universal preschool is coming. We think it should be supported, and we think CAA should be involved in helping bring that about and in playing some role. Whether the Head Start programs and CAAs are going to be the preschool for all 4-year-olds, whether they're going to be preschool for kids from families with low incomes, whether they're going to be the preschool for children with disabilities, I think all that will be worked out on a state-by-state basis. So there's some other things happening in human development. As we know, the research in the past 10 years has blossomed in areas of nutrition, brain research, the effect of adverse childhood experiences, and all this has been pulled into the Head Start program through the Parent Family Community Engagement Framework and the Health Framework. It's also being pulled into other program approaches that are now being called two-generation approaches. Well, you can say community action's always done two generations, and I think that's true, but I think the technology, or rather the program strategies based on all of these new scientific findings are far more sophisticated than what we did 20 or even 10 years ago. So there is much learning to do here. Okay, and there's a whole series of issues around the criminal justice system. You've got 3 million people in jail, mostly men, mostly minorities. You've got 20 million people with a criminal record of some kind, which almost guarantees you're not going to get a job in the mainstream middle-income, middle-class economy. So we have created a system which over time seems to make sense, on sort of a person-by-person basis. But when you look at the cumulative effect of it, we've got a real problem here in terms of how we deal with people who commit crimes and in terms of reintegrating them into society. So in the human development dimension of the student loans is that there's $1.36 trillion in student loans out. These loans cannot be forgiven. They cannot be cleared by bankruptcy. And we've got this huge overhang, which is about as big as car loans, about as big as credit card debt, which are a real burden for the people who borrowed these $30 to $50 to $70 to $120,000, much of it from private for-profit universities, some of which the government is finally cracking down on and saying, hey, if your people aren't getting jobs, we're not, of course, going to stop loaning money to your students to attend your university. So there's something good happening there. So the conditional cash transfer program started in Latin America. It's now being tried particularly in New York City. And the idea here, conditional cash transfer means you get cash conditioned on certain behaviors, particularly around parenting. In Latin America, this started around immunizations and school attendance. In New York City, they are testing the effect of conditional cash transfers as an incentive for parents to get their kids to school on time. And the cash transfer can be very small, like $2 a week or something like that. It doesn't have to be much, but Americans in particular respond to cash. So they're trying some experiments to see what effect of this cash transfer system might produce. I mentioned criminal justice, the numbers of people incarcerated and convicted, and it looks like this is a very interesting area where both the liberals and the conservatives in Congress are actually, even though they may have different motives for doing this, coming at this issue. This started in Texas, ironically, where they have a huge number of people in prison, and they figured out this is costing a lot of money, both in dollar terms and in societal impact terms. There are numerous efforts to look at the sentencing provisions, what kinds of crimes people are put in prison for, how long they're in prison for those types of crimes, et cetera. If you look at just drug use, simple drug use, which has about 1 million people in jail waiting trial or in prison, my opinion is most of the drug use crime should be taken out of the criminal justice domain and put in the health and education domains. Or if you could go the direction like Portugal, which completely decriminalized drug use of all types. Michael Moore, the documentarian, in his documentary, Which Country Shall We Invade Next, invaded Portugal. He's talking to the cops. So if you're walking down the street and you see somebody sitting there smoking crack, you do nothing. And the cop said, that's right, because drug use is not illegal in Portugal. Other countries are moving in a similar direction, Denmark, Sweden, et cetera. We have a lot to learn from other countries, but we're not very good at that in America. So we had some thoughts around the safety net. Most other countries have figured out what the minimum quality of life that they want all citizens to have. This level of not being destitute provides a clear-cut floor in most societies, not in America. We still have a hodgepodge of things to help prevent destitution. SNAP, LIHEAP, TANF, et cetera. And these things, when you look at them, they don't add up into any kind of coherent understanding or policy about what this minimum floor should be. I grew up in Kansas, where the TANF amount for a family of 3 is $267. Right across the border in Missouri, and you can't tell where this border is unless you know where it is. Right across the border in Missouri, 50 feet away, it's $136. I mean, this just doesn't make any sense. But we have no agreement in America about what the anti-destitution floor should be, so we're constantly doing this patchwork, small intervention activity to try to keep people from being evicted or starving, and we got all kinds of problems at the anti-destitution level. So another safety net issue is that in the 1969 to 71 period, the Office of Economic Opportunity pioneered experiments on the guaranteed annual income. President Richard Nixon supported this. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, his Assistant Secretary of HEW, supported this. And these several experiments gave people a modest amount of money at the time. I think it was about $400 a month a family. And they were testing to see what effect it had on people's willingness to work. And what they discovered in all but one of the experiments, it had no effect at all. And in New Jersey, one of the 9 experiments, it had a moderately depressing effect on people's willingness to work. But several other nations are now exploring this concept, whether you call it universal basic income, guaranteed annual income, and we should look at this again, in part because, as you'll see, or as you've seen in the detailed webinars that we've done in the past, all the trends that are undercutting people's ability to make a living are still in place, and there's no indication that these trends are going to be reversed, whether you're talking about globalization, automation, corporate practices, or the government's inability to respond to those other dynamics. Those trends have been in place for about 40 years. They're kind of slow moving, but the cumulative effect is this massive shift where you've got people unable to find full-time work. So you've got 6 million people that have dropped out of the workforce completely. You've got about 14 million unemployed. You've got 9 million people on disability, which has doubled in the last few years. You've got 20 million people with criminal records that can't get a decent job, and on and on. And these trends are just getting worse. And so that's why we're thinking we need to provide enough money for people to live on somehow, whether you do that as a guaranteed annual income or some say a children's savings account. Every kid that's born gets $20,000 put in a bank account that draws interest until they're 18 or 20. Whether you do this through children's allowances, every kid gets $400 a month or whatever. We need to find some way to provide enough money into households with low incomes that they can make a living. We are not doing that now as a society, and as we say, the trends in terms of the workplace are going to get worse. So supporting low-income energy subsidies and weatherization, now you've got these depletion allowances where extractors of natural resources are given all kinds of subsidies and benefits and tax breaks and so forth, and we should begin phasing down those subsidies and incentives and using the resultant increase in revenue to finance conservation programs. In particular, we think that energy conservation is a huge opportunity area for CAAs. Weatherization should be expanded to include washing machines and dryers and dishwashers. There should be solar on every roof. And it's the only way the U.S. is going to meet its energy demand needs in the future. Nukes would be the short way to do it, but the American people and my wife don't like all this nuclear waste laying around and the prospect of either an earthquake or a crackpot blowing up a nuclear reactor. So since we probably can't do nukes in America, conservation is really the only pathway forward, and I think CAAs are extremely well positioned for that. Okay, so what else have we got here? So we go into some family formation issues, and as a general proposition, single motherhood is a recipe for poverty. More than 50% of single mothers have been poor every year for the past 50 years, and these are different single mothers. It's the structural societal dimension of this is that if you are a single parent raising kids, for the most part, you cannot balance home duties and work duties in a way that you're going to be able to earn enough money to support that family. I was a single parent for 2 years, and it's an incredible challenge. So our thought process on this is that you've got to have 2 incomes in a household that has kids. And some people say, oh, marriage is the answer. Well, it is for some people, and they should do it. But the 2 incomes is far more important. And whether these folks are straight or gay or related or just friends or it's a business arrangement or whatever, we're trying to find ways for you to think about to get two incomes into that household when there are children present, because you've got to have that kind of buffer. Whether it means we move back to the way Americans lived in 1880 with 3 generations living in the same space, or new kinds of relationships are formed, or we have more religious or hippie-type communes. I'm not sure what the answer is, except I know the problem can only be solved if you get more than one income in that household. So there's some interesting work about college graduates. Now about a third of the people in America are college graduates, and as a group they're doing pretty well. They marry each other, they both work, they've got 2 incomes, so when one of them's out of work, the other one can support the household. But there's an interesting, I say interesting, not necessarily desirable, split forming in America between the relatively high educated people who marry each other and live in the same neighborhoods and people who are not relatively high educated and who live in the same neighborhoods. So we're seeing some of that play out in this presidential election, but there's something happening here. We can't have a society where only college graduates can make a living, because 2/3 of the adults are not college graduates. So we've got some additional thinking here. In the 1960s, the Office of Economic Opportunity spent the first federal money on family planning. I remember I was the OEO field rep for the St. Louis CAA. They were about number 6 in taking OEO money and subcontracting it to Planned Parenthood for family planning purposes. I think every child needs to be desired, and there's some interesting new developments, the long-acting reversible contraceptives, that a little tiny 1/4-inch thing slipped under the skin someplace and that lasts for months until it either wears off or is removed. I'm looking at my granddaughters as they approach puberty and thinking, what larks, what a great idea, you know? So I think we should reconsider this attack on Planned Parenthood, in my opinion, is unwarranted, and CAA should be working closely with their local Planned Parenthood and other family planning providers. We've just got to make sure that when a child arrives, it's because the parents want that child to arrive. So there's a great new book out, The Way We Never Were, and the gist of it is, let's not get too wrapped up in what we think the family was like in the good old days. These good old days were a lot more problematic than the current mythology suggests. So there's some interesting stuff happening in just how we talk about poverty and security. This started with Ford Foundation grants in the 1980s and 1990s, the work of linguists like George Lakoff, where they look at how language is used and how people use phraseology in ways that reflect fundamental values and beliefs. One dimension of this is this false narrative thing, that the reason women are poor is because they receive TANF. Whereas if you go back to 1936, when aid to dependent children was created, it was created because women were poor at the time, because their husbands had been killed or injured in a mine accident or a logging accident or something like that, and had no income. So, but the idea that the solution causes the problem is a zany, twisted interpretation of reality. Now, I'm sure that there probably is at least one TANF recipient who doesn't deserve it. Just statistically, that would seem likely. But 97% of TANF recipients do deserve it, And the idea that TANF itself causes the problem of women not having enough money is a zany misinterpretation of reality. What's the logical fallacy? Ergo hoc post proctor hoc. There you go. The thing that the result caused the cause, or something like that. Anyhow, this whole false narrative thing, and Alan and I are going to do more work on this, is something that we have to avoid getting trapped in. Both the Center for Community Change and the Frameworks Institute have issued guidance on like phrases like economic security for all, economic opportunity for all Americans, and other cultural universals that benefit all people, whether you call this sidewalks, clean water, education, good streets, or Social Security, or Medicare. Things that apply to all Americans are more powerful than things that apply to just some Americans. And economic security, again, is something that everybody can relate to and aspire to. Whereas, well, let me just recirculate here. The research of these organizations suggests that anti-poverty as a concept lost its oomph in about 1980 and has not been a powerful motivator that expands the base of the number of people who are willing to support additional investment in anti-poverty efforts. One of the reasons that things have been sort of stalled remember we went through this enormous expansion from the 1960s into 1980s of anti-poverty programs of all types, and then it sort of flattened out. And they go into this analysis that the concept of reducing poverty is not as powerful a concept as providing economic security for all. So there's a lot more to be done here, and I know the partnership is in serious conversation with the Frameworks Institute about how to proceed on that, so more coming in that area as well. So reframing poverty as a public health issue is a very interesting area where these two domains are softening at the edges. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation is doing a 5-year, several $100 million exploration of how poverty and other health-related social needs fit together and how the conditions in which people live, whether it's housing, income, transportation, et cetera, contribute to health dysfunction. So there's some very interesting work going on there that is, in effect, blending our work in human development, our work in anti-poverty, our work in promoting economic security, and the health side of the universe. So there's some very interesting stuff going on there. Alan, you want to talk about housing?
Yeah. Am I on? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Can everybody else hear you?
That means that I guess everybody else can hear us here. Lack of affordable housing, that's a huge, huge growing problem in the United States as the economy continues to grow, and but as the economy continues to grow, pay continues to slump at the lower end of the U.S. Wage scale, and this is probably the biggest driver of homelessness in the United States. And then we have this local concern where, not in my backyard, NIMBYism is being used to block solutions for affordable housing. It may be true in your area, but it certainly is true in my area that anytime housing of any kind is looking to be built by local builders, developers, so on and so forth, inclusionary housing is always a part of that package, and yet the environmental community goes all out to block that. And most recently, we had a big initiative referendum on on planning for housing that essentially it was voted massively by the community to block any kind of future housing and development in our county. Those are communities that do allow some flexibility for building housing. They usually require a density bonus. That is to say, the higher the density of your development, the more affordable housing you need to include. And when we talk about building code flexibility, we talk about allowing for small homes, tiny homes, Jim likes to call them, so that they don't have to necessarily meet all of building code requirements, and the floor space gets more efficiently used. Mortgage subsidies for first-time home buyers. I'm not sure that there are any these days, but some states and the federal government used to make that available to first-time home buyers, meaning that if you're a family and planning to buy your first home, the bank could apply for a mortgage subsidy that it would underwrite part of the mortgage, the interest rate on the mortgage, and instead of paying the going rate of 4 or 5%, would be cut to maybe 3%. And that was a big boom to those who were trying to get into the housing market. And most important is the sensible banking regulations related to mortgage lending. As soon as the global recession was over with in 2009, the regulators, the banking regulators, put into place these very stiff lending standards. And as time goes on, these are being loosened up and lowered so that more and more people can qualify for a mortgage. Anyway, let me just say one more thing. When I wrote the new piece for the white paper, I had the pleasure of visiting the Butte Community Action Agency up in Chico, California, and meeting with our partnership president, Tom Tamarino, and he took me on a tour of their housing program. And I have to say, they have quite the advanced housing program that I think would be very can be replicated anywhere in the U.S. And I think it would serve as a good model to work from. Okay, next slide. Okay, Jim, you have your tip.
So Alan and I said, okay, we've got 100 good things that should be done. What is it that we recommend that CAAs work on in their advocacy efforts at the national level, the state level, at the local level? What are some areas which, if we were successful in them, would produce real change? One of them is making work pay. Raise the minimum wage, index it to the increase in the economy. I like $22 an hour. That would produce a living wage of $48,000 per year for a family. And I think that's a good target to try for. Again, these are things that can be done at the state and local level as well. Expand the earned income tax credit. Increasingly, we're going to have to compensate people for the social value of their work when the economic value of their work does not produce enough pay for them to make it on. We need to reform capitalism. There's excellent stuff out there. Robert Reich, Elizabeth Warren, Bob Stiglitz. The economists, the progressive economists are laying out excellent pathways forward, and we need to be paying attention to these and figuring out how to bring them about. I like the idea of corporations sharing 50% of the profits with employees rather than leaving it in the bank or giving it to the hedge funds. The structural racism issue, as we see on TV almost every day, is very real. The partnership has formed a terrific arrangement with the Kellogg Foundation, and you can look at that in this PDF here. there's a lot of work that remains to be done. The structural racism is the fact that when Social Security first passed in the 30s, it excluded people who worked in domestic work or on agricultural work, and 2/3 of blacks worked in domestic or agricultural work, and that wasn't rectified until the 50s. When the Federal Housing Administration first started making loans in the 1940s, and it systematically excluded minority borrowers. So there are things that were structured into public policies that precluded blacks in particular from acquiring assets. Most of us rode the housing market up from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it was only very recently that the problems that were structured into the lending process back then were revealed, and how they systematically excluded blacks from the ability to appreciate the value of their house. So I like the idea of make work, whether you call it public service employment, whether you call it infrastructure repair. I think that there's no substitute for public investment in creating jobs that produce socially useful results. In particular, we're looking at conservation of all types of infrastructure. Again, the universal basic income, I don't see any alternative except to create some form of this in the future because there's just not going to be enough paying jobs for everybody. Certainly Medicare for all, and whether you call this the Affordable Care Act or whether you call it Medicare for all or whether you call it single payer, you've got to find a way to provide insurance and medical treatment for the population. Housing, Alan's already talked about these kinds of things. In the 50s and 60s, a man could get a job swinging a shovel or unloading a ship for 10 or 20 bucks a day and sleep in a tenement, a flop house for 3 or 4 bucks a night. Those jobs are gone, that housing is gone, and so you've got people living on the streets who 40 years ago, they'd had a way to make a living. Decriminalizing most drug use, a lot going on there, and then kids investing in prenatal to 3rd grade. Again, there's more on all these topics in the white paper. Alan, you're next. What do you had some additional ones?
Absolutely. We get to the next slide here. Here we go.
There you go.
I decided on just taking 5 out of the white paper. Number 1, which I think all community action agencies are already involved in, is to provide affordable child care. We work our child care program at the federal level and at the state level to provide more affordable child care. CAAs can easily be in the business of creating these child care programs in their low-income communities. They've got the experience, they can do it, and I think we should make that as a number 1 target. And as you probably are aware, both our presidential candidates have put child care on their agenda. So I think that's a good thing. Reform the local criminal justice system by ending minority exploitation of arrest, heavy fines for breaking minor laws. You know, that's a huge, huge issue throughout the United States. I think there's a lot of people who are on the same side of doing that. I think we need to take advantage of that agreement and make it happen. Having been working in human resource management for a number of years, I'm well aware of the fact that there's a huge amount of wage theft going on, misclassification of jobs, that is to say, making a permanent employee into a contractor, and we need to also strengthen workers' rights to organize. Unions have always been a good platform of which to be able to ensure the availability of good paying jobs. When we talk about wage theft, we see a lot of companies withholding or deducting the wages of employees for things that are not legal. They don't pay them for overtime, and I know now that the Department of Labor and employment organizations are all working to redo the regulations related to that. Off-the-clock violations, that's a huge problem among the working class, the working poor. That is to say, after they clock out, they still have to work, and they don't get paid for it. Outright wage forfeiting, or as in most instances, that's just bankruptcy of the small businesses to keep from having to pay their workers. And this goes on all the time, everywhere. And not a whole heck of a lot is being done about that. Well, our Congress and our state legislatures need to get involved in preventing this wage forfeiting through bankruptcy and other means. Federally standardized and mandatory sick time and family leave laws. The state of California, where I live in, is leading the nation around these sick time and family leave laws. And one of the things they have recently mandated for all employers is a minimum of 3 days a year for sick time. And then my final one is providing banking services in low-income communities throughout the U.S. 10 million Americans are without banking services, and one of the ways we strongly recommend is to enlarge the mission of the U.S. Post Office to include banking services. At one time it did that, but that went away over 50, 60 years ago. So that's my final thought.
Okay, let me add one thing on the jobs issue, permanent versus contractor. Of the 11 million jobs created since the end of the recession in 2009, about 40% of those are 1099 jobs, i.e. you don't get a W-2, you get a 1099, which means that you are paying your own Social Security, your own insurance, your own retirement, et cetera. So there's a lot going on with regard to that set of issues, and Alan has got more information about them in the white paper. So one of the things we want to ask is, what are your top 5 or 10 strategies that you think would make a real impact? Sure, services help a few people, anti-destitution services help a few people. What do you think are the big, powerful strategies that, if implemented, would expand economic opportunity and economic security? We want you to email them to us. And when you download this PowerPoint, you can find our email addresses in there. One of the other things that we wanted to talk about briefly today, and we've got 5 minutes left, is the theory of change. We've worked long and hard over the past couple of years to come up with a National Community Action Network theory of change, which I think does a pretty good job of describing who we are and what we do. I want to mention in the context of a great paper, which you'll see the citation for in a minute, this terrific paper Ms. Sarah Stachowiak has written, and she describes how change happens in America. The large leaps or punctuated equilibrium theory is that things stay the same for 20 or 30 years, and then you have a big reshuffling of the deck. This happened in the early 1900s. It happened during the Depression. It happened during the 60s. Some people think it happened in the Reagan years when we had another reshuffling. My opinion is we're due for another big reshuffling because of the huge volume of books and articles that have come out in the last 2 or 3 years. Same thing happened in the 30s. Same thing happened in the 60s when all kinds of ideas were being floated. And you got to be ready when the punctuated equilibrium begins to shuffle and have your ideas ready to go. The policy window or agenda setting theory, a good example of that's what's happened in child care with the prenatal brain research, nutrition, adverse childhood experiences. The researchers and the Congress essentially have agreed together, and that's where you're seeing huge investments in the prenatal to 5, and I think that's going to continue. One of our main strategies in community action has always been the coalition theory. 200 people sign a letter saying this or that should happen. I'm not sure how powerful that is, but it's one of the methods that most human service organizations use. And then you've got other theories around the power politics or power elites. If some big shot decides that it should happen, then it should happen. The regime theory is, in effect, who controls Congress. And if you have a different regime, you'll get a different set of actions taking place there. Tactical theories, more something individual agencies can look at. The messaging and frameworks theory, media influence, what are the media people saying that sets the agenda? Grassroots community organizing, community action had a proud history of that in the 60s and 70s, not so much anymore. Group formation or self-categorization theory, women, blacks, Latinos, et cetera, to some extent provide a basis for social change. And then the diffusion theories, where over time, a group of people who follow an issue agree that a new method is better than the old method, so they choose. So here's a hot link to our paper, very interesting stuff, and I encourage you to look at that. There are other theories about change, which we described, and my final thought is the power of myth overrides facts in most societies. You got to understand the myths. The myth of the American dream is that everybody can make it as long as you try hard and obey the law. Well, most people can make it, but not everybody. So you need to figure out the extent to which the myth is true and which is not, and what do we do about the facts that it's not. So I think with that, we'll see if any questions have come in. We'll see. You can always email Alan or me about questions about any of this or about any aspect of the white paper. Again, our emails are in the PowerPoint, and they're in the white paper. We love talking about this stuff, so keep us posted on what your thoughts are on what community action should be doing on these big issues. Again, here's our final slide, and Hyacinth, I think we're ready to turn this back over to you about the future webinars. And you had another bibliography that came in that you wanted to mention from ICF.
Yeah, Jim, if you want to go ahead, we actually have until 2:30, so if you want to go ahead and talk about that bibliography, or if there's anything else from your presentation that you guys want to go into a little bit further detail about. We haven't gotten any questions yet, so hopefully, shameless plug, if anybody has any questions or thoughts, please send them in to us. But Jim, you can go ahead and talk about the ICF bibliography if you'd like.
Okay, so when we started 2 years ago, we spent a lot of time on the conditions of poverty. Then we moved into the causes of poverty. Then we moved into what the think tanks are saying. And then we moved into the white paper, what Alan and I think. Is that a pun? I don't know. What Alan and I are suggesting that people look at more closely and consider for community action, either on the national level, the state level, or the local level. Many of these are public policies that require advocacy, that require education, not just of elected officials, but of the citizenry as well. So we have presented a couple of hundred papers in the bibliographies, and the partnership has received a document from ICF called Poverty Trends in the United States, that looks, I'm not sure who wrote this, but it looks over studies from the past 10 years or so and presents some additional information. One thing in the ICF paper that we have not spent a good deal of time on is deep poverty. Deep poverty is, there literally are people in the U.S. who are living on less than $2 a day. Many of them are 100 years old and pretty frail. Many of them are kids in very large families in rural areas. Many of them are women for whom the, quote, welfare reform of 1966 was a disastrous impact. The cuts in welfare were a disastrous impact on their life. But the deep poverty issue of people really who've got nothing as far as capacity for day-to-day living, many of whom are experiencing hunger and health issues, is not an area that we have spent a lot of time on, and I see that this ICF bibliography has this, one of their 4 sections focuses on that. So I think the partnership can add this bibliography to the other materials and the many studies on the topic. That's really all I have to say for today. Again, we're looking forward next year. We want to go into greater detail about how you can use this national trend information in your local area to shape your community assessment. We're working on some materials to help you better understand your regional economy and how it's connected to the global economy, because much of our thinking is still bounded by our national, state, and county boundaries, but in fact the economy works on a regional basis. The Department of Commerce and the Department of Agriculture say there are 179 economic regions in the United States. These are connected to the global economy, and the dynamics and interaction there are something that we need to develop a better understanding of, because that interaction between the regional economy and the global economy significantly shapes the opportunities for paid employment, for example, in an area. So we're going to go into that. And we're going to be looking for a smaller group of CAAs that function in the learning community similar to how the other learning communities operate, where 10 or 15 people spend more time in dialogue about the issues in the subject area. So we want to know, for example, what is happening in your area with regard to these national trends. We did a little experiment with Wyandotte County and Kansas City, Kansas, my hometown, looking at how much information exists on the city and county level with respect to these national trends. We've got all these great national trends. 6 million people dropped out of the workforce, X number of people working at sub-minimum wage, X number of people on disability, et cetera, et cetera. To what extent are we able to find these data on a local level? So Alan made the initial foray and did a terrific job of finding out what we can find out about these national trends in the local area, and what only exists on a national trend basis and is very difficult to discern on a local area. We want to go into that on a deeper basis next year, and are looking for a few CAAs that want to reshape or to expand the community assessments they do to have a finer grained understanding of how the economy operates in their area, and why we have these 40-year trends of reduced social mobility, flattening wages, et cetera. So that's another thing that we want to do next year. So Alan, do you have any final thoughts before we sign off here?
Not really. All to say that going back to reframing, my favorite anecdote right now comes from the state of Kansas, and the governor, Mr. Brownback, and his legislature has decided to relabel public schools as government schools. The foundation for that is way back in the Reagan era, when Reagan was running for president. He would castigate the U.S. government and all government levels as being very poor and unproductive, and why should we be paying our taxes for this? And so that reframing has carried out all throughout these years to the point where now conservatives, and particularly in the state of Kansas, have relabeled their public schools as government schools to make them look bad. And this is the point of why we should be very careful about choosing our terminology and developing our strategy around framing. Anyway,
a sociologist named Robert Frank wrote a book a few years ago, What's the Matter with Kansas? Kansas is your case study in supply-side economics, i.e. the idea that if you cut taxes and reduce public investments, somehow this is going to create a gigantic blossoming in the private sector. And so under Governor Brownback, they did cut taxes. The number of state employees has been reduced from 12,000 to about 9,000. They've cut investments in public education. Many rural school superintendents are either vacating their position and leaving it empty or reducing their hours. But the gist of it is, so far, the big experiment has not paid off. Kansas has a lower growth rate than the surrounding states. The state government is $500 million in debt, a short budget shortfall, and the governor recently announced that his dashboard system for measuring economic progress and economic growth and employment growth and so forth is being discontinued because they don't like what it's saying. So I think if everyone, if you hear in your state legislature, your governor talking about supply-side economics and using it more vigorously at the state level, take a look at what's going on in Kansas, and you might have second thoughts about that. Again, we very much want to hear from you about what you think community action should be doing, either on a national level, what you think should be, your agency should be doing, and we'll be coming back to you with more information about opportunities for participating next year. So I'm done with that. We'll turn it back to Hyacinth for closing comments.
Thank you so much, Jim and Alan. As always, we always appreciate your insight and all of the resources and information you share on poverty that's affecting our country and the different ways that we can stay in tune with that and the resources and voices that are available. So thank you both so much. And also, the webinar that Jim was just discussing, where they looked at poverty trends in his hometown, is actually available on our website. So if you go, I believe that was session 3 of the National Poverty Trends webinar series. You can actually check that out. But we do thank you for joining us today, and we would just like to remind you all that we are very excited to announce that we are in the process of actually adding some new materials to the National Webinar Series. So in addition to the great materials that are being presented by Jim and Alan and some of our other mainstays like ICF and the National Alliance to End Homelessness, we're actually in the process of developing some webinar presentation materials for our Health Intersections Open Learning Community Group, and also on the theory of change, which Jim briefly discussed earlier today. We're also going to have some features on trauma-informed approaches to alleviating poverty and place-based strategies for community revitalization. So if you're interested in any of those topics or the ones that we are currently hosting, please feel free to check out our website for updates to our presentation schedule, and you'll also be able to register there. So now the two webinars that we have coming up are, of course, our Decreasing Family Homelessness webinar series is continuing that is hosted in collaboration with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and that will be on November 9th at 2 p.m. You can actually click on the link on the screen here to register if you're interested in that. And of course, if you didn't get enough of Jim and Alan today, they're continuing their webinar mini-series. We can never get enough of you guys. That's why we always have you guys back.
Thank you.
But if you want to hear more from Jim and Alan, they're actually going to be doing another presentation at the end of November. And again, you can click on the link on your screen to register and check that out. Of course, here is the contact information for the rest of the LCRC team here on the screen. If you have any questions, concerns, or suggestions on how to improve our webinars, please let us know. We're always interested and appreciate your feedback. And I think that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.